welcome to the 7th season of the television series Steppin' Outdoors. I'm your host, Stephanie Rainey. I've combined my passion for the outdoors along with my experience as an outdoor writer and videographer to present to you a television show filled with exciting outdoor adventures from the beautiful White Mountains of Arizona. Join me each week as I venture into the outdoors to bring you programs about the fascinating people and places of northern Arizona. All of this while providing you a glimpse into what awaits us all in the great outdoors. Welcome to another edition of Steppin' Outdoors. Today I'm joining the Arizona Game and Fish Department, and we're heading into areas where the Wallow Fire burned. Right now I'm standing on the 25 road, only miles from where the Wallow Fire began. I'll show you the good, the bad, and the really ugly areas where the fire burned, and hopefully answer questions you and I both have about what happens next for the recovery of the Apache Sitgraves Forest. Be sure and stay tuned to this special edition of Steppin' Outdoors. I'm here with Mike Godwin from the Arizona Game and Fish Department Pine Top region. Mike, what's your title with Game and Fish?
Stephanie, I'm a supervisor for the east sector of the Pine Top region, and I supervise 5 wildlife managers. What we do basically is manage the wildlife resources and habitats within the ABARS Forest, Apache Sitgraves National Forest.
Okay. And would you mind taking us around to some of the areas affected by the Wallow Fire?
I think that would be a good thing for us to do, Stephanie.
All right, let's get going.
Part of what the Game and Fish Department did right post-fire was become a part of the Forest Service's burned area emergency response team. And as a part of that, we also had a wildlife sub-team that started doing analysis on impacts to wildlife. So we spent the better part of a month looking throughout the fire relative to game species while we were doing an analysis. And what we found is very few direct mortalities as a result of the fire on large animals, bears, elk, deer. They basically moved out of the way as the fire was progressing through the forest. We did have some mortality, and that's to be expected relative to the age of animals, the fawns. Well, there weren't any fawns on the ground. The calves, the elk calves, probably there was a high mortality there. And indeed, we found a difference between the calving rates inside and outside of the burned area. During one day survey, I counted 453 elk total from the area of Sierra Blanca to Mexican Hay Lake. And those are all elk that are attributed to be having stayed interior of the fire. And they had a 37% fawn or calf crop. The herds that were outside of the fire, that had been pushed out of the fire or existed outside of the fire area already, at that same time period had about a 60% calf crop. And so we certainly lost a few calves, but adult animal-wise, we don't think we lost very many. Well, like I said, we found one mortality. The other side of the spectrum is when you move to the smaller animals, such as turkeys, which is still a big game animal, but it's a small animal itself. By all of the data that we collected, the areas interior to the fire, 2 things we think occurred. One, we probably had a significant, if not almost total, loss of our poults. At the time the fire broke out, the poults were just after being hatched, and so they would not have had the ability to evade. And the fact that they would be trapped in trees when the fire came through at night, and or the speed at which it moved during the day. In addition to that, the number of hours that we spent in the field looking at turkeys and getting turkey observations, we think the adult population took a significant hit. We were only able to count 100 birds total in 3,800 hours of field time during that post-fire period of doing emergency response work with the bear team. In comparison, on a normal year, spending 30 to 60 hours in each of the game management units 1 and 27, we see a total of about 600 turkeys during the August-September survey period. And so 100 in both units over 3,800 hours versus 600 in both units over what would attribute probably 120 hours total. You can't directly compare those two numbers because they're during different time periods, but they are a really good indication that the population within the burned area had a significant impact. And thus the department chose to reduce the fall tags significantly, and we're going to reduce the spring tags significantly as well. The hunt areas will still all be open and available, and we encourage people to continue to put in for those hunts. And if you get drawn for 1 or 27, we recommend that you hunt outside of the burned area, because we do believe that the bird population within the burned area will be significantly impacted in such a way that it'll be hard to find birds. B, we want to keep that recruitment there to be able to keep the potential for getting birds back into that population in the years to come when the habitat starts to improve as high as we can.
I'm on the road to Big Lake. Big Lake is basically just right up there. You can see some of this is burned right through here, but a lot of the grasses have already come up.
And when we first arrived at Three Forks, the intensity of the burn within that complex of drainages was significant, and it was rather amazing and impressive how hot the fires got and how much of the forest was consumed. And there was concern of ash and sediment runoff down into the water courses and springs within Three Forks. But in the short period since we began our work there about the 21st of June to 2 or 3 weeks later, and the rains began, the green up in Three Forks has been surprising. And also during that period, we've had enough observations to know that the bighorn sheep that live in and around Three Forks, from Three Forks down through the Black River drainage to the White Mountain Apache Indian Reservation, which we share that population with, those sheep are doing what they have been doing in that drainage all along, almost unaffected by the fact that the fire came through there. There's been sheep seen at Three Forks. There's been sheep seen near Buffalo Crossing and between Buffalo Crossing and Wildcat Crossing, which is 6 or 7 miles, river miles downstream from Buffalo Crossing. And the sheep that we're seeing, they've got lambs with them. There was a group that was observed, 18 sheep total, 15 ewes and 3 lambs. So they seem to be doing okay. Long term, the effects on the sheep will be similar to the effects on other grazing ungulates. They're going to do well. The browse species that'll come back, the forbs and grasses that'll come back after post-fire will be higher in nutrient value, and these animals will be able to utilize those browse species and have more variety and more availability. When the Wallow Fire erupted, one of the things that we saw it do was moved a number of elk north and east into the communities of Eager, Springerville, South Fork, Nutrioso, and Alpine. And what we saw occurring were several hundred more elk than we have had in the past on private property, and they were persisting there throughout the day, all day long. And that was the only place that elk had any place to eat and stay, because basically the fire had burned them out of their home. So in consideration of that, discussions began with the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the Arizona Elk Society about what we might be able to do to help some of these private property owners and livestock operators that had leased private property to run their livestock on. Well, in a big way, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the Arizona Elk Society stepped up and contributed $150,000 between the two of them to buy 575 tons of alfalfa hay that was shipped to the White Mountains. The Hopi Three Canyons Ranch, which is the old 26 bar ranch, volunteered their barn to store all this hay in while we're distributing it to the various people that are participating in the program. Jeff Wells, one of the owners of Cowboy Up Feeds in Springerville, has given the use of his squeeze and his time at a very, very moderate cost replacement for his fuel and equipment to be able to load out all this hay. And what we've done is about 70 people have applied to be a part of this program, incorporating several thousands of acres where we observed elk all day long for 3 and 4 weeks at a time. Now, these elk were here throughout the period of the fire and throughout part of the post period of the fire, and they persisted on those private properties throughout that time. The program was designed with two objectives. The first objective was to try to assist these individuals that had wildlife persisting on their private property for quite some time, to the effect of what those elk may have eaten on the private property and the potential growth of those grasses and forbs on the private property that would have been there had those elk not been there. The other important component of this program was the elk had no place to be besides the riparian areas within the forest. That was one of the few places left in the Wallow Fire burned area that had any available forage. Well, a number of our riparian areas are critical habitat for a whole host of other species, and elk in mass can have an adverse impact on those riparian areas. And so we wanted to hold the elk back out of the forest until the forest had a chance to start to recover, which it has. And naturally, the elk have begun to move back to the forest because there's green grass available to them again, and they're going to eat the best, always. That's what they're going to go for, and that's what they're doing. They're moved back at the forest on their own. Now, if the private land pastures have any tie to those elk staying there, the department certainly plans to utilize our population management hunts to push those elk back to the forest. And we can do that with those hunts either through direct harvest or through pressure, and just making those private lands not a desirable place for elk to persist long term. Right now we're at Conklin Ridge, southwest of Big Lake. The run of the fire that came up Conklin Ridge was pretty hot the day that it came up, and the flame lengths on this were reported at over 500 feet. And in comparison, during the Rodeo Chedeschi fire, what I know of the flame lengths in that fire were 350 to 400 feet. So there was a lot of fuel on this ridge that was consumed during this burn. The forest and the Game and Fish Department have been working together relative to access for all forest users, and from the Game and Fish Department's perspective, the importance for us is for people that want to fish and hunt. And the forest has been doing an awesome job relative to getting the evaluation of potential access completed, getting hazardous trees removed from the roadways, starting with the main roads, the biggest used roads, clearing a couple of 100 feet off those roads so that forest users can have those access routes relatively safe. You know, in a fire like this, there's always the potential for having problems on any of the roadways relative to current events, whether it's a wind event or a rain event, reclosing a road that they've opened. So the work that they're doing is important, but forest users need to remember that during certain times or conditions, a road could be reclosed and they could be trapped. So it's important to pay attention when you're in the fire to what's going on around you, where it's raining and where you're at, and what the potential hazards are. While they're doing this work, clearing the roadways, they're also salvaging the timber that they can. And so you'll see along the roadways while they're cutting a number of trees that'll be bunked up in piles, and they'll come back in with trucks and the equipment to load them up and move them out, which that's keeping the community involved in the activities of evaluating the fire hazards and eliminating the hazards that they can relative to some of the operators that run the mills and move trees, being able to stay at work. Okay, relative to bear team activities and what that means for the fire and what's been going on. As the burn was about put out, the forest initiated the bear team, and bear stands for Burned Area Emergency Response Team. And this was the first opportunity that the Arizona Game and Fish Department has had to participate in a bear team officially. We had 3 members from the Pine Top Regional Office that were on the bear team doing wildlife, fisheries, and habitat work with the range folks. And that team, the specific purposes of that team is to evaluate post-fire potential effects and what mitigating factors can be determined to relieve those effects relative to the priorities of protection, and that is life, property, cultural and natural resources. And the enormity of the Wallow Fire really dictated that those priorities be focused on life and property. And so a great deal of their work focused on how do we mitigate the post-fire effects that are going to impact the communities of Greer, Eager, Springerville, Nutrioso, Alpine, Sprucedale, and Blue River communities. And a lot of the work focused on channelization or channel control and erosion from rains. And so the work that was implemented as the bear team was progressing through their evaluations, and it began almost simultaneously with them working on roads and culvert protection, and then the slope protection came in the form of seeding, aerial seeding, and they aerially seeded 2 mixes of grass, a high elevation and a low elevation mix of native grass species. The only non-native species that was contained in the mix was a non-persistent annual grass like a barley, and which will persist for a year or 2 because it'll seed itself, but then it'll be gone. And the reason they put that in there is because that's a very successful plant for stabilizing soils rapidly. And that allows the soils to be saved on the slopes, and then for the native seeds to get a chance to germinate and start to grow. And because those annuals are not persistent and they'll be gone shortly, it's not of great concern that they're in those habitats for that short period of time. And right after they seeded, they mulched with straw. And there's some 230 semi-loads of straw at 25 tons a semi-load that are being lifted by helicopters and set on these slopes above the communities to try to minimize or to reduce, in a significant way at least, the runoff of ash and sediments from these steep slopes around the community. There's so much of it that they had to work on that the work ahead of them was enormous. They've done a good job at addressing all of the immediate needs around the communities. They're not able to stop all the runoff, but that immediate need relative to those slopes and those drainages is where they focus their efforts. And in addition to that, some members of the bear team, myself included, looked at wildlife habitats and critical factors within those wildlife habitats. What was it that was potentially going to be impacted or in jeopardy? And most of that had to do relative to endangered species. The spring snail, the California floater, which is a mollusk, the Mexican gray wolf, Chiricahua leper frog, and the Mexican spotted owl. Those were the species that we looked at their habitats and what mitigation factors might we be able to put in place to protect the habitats that are limited in distribution and potentially going to be impacted significantly from after fire effects from flooding and sedimentation. There will be areas in here where we're going to try to do some work with the forest and as a wildlife agency in looking at are there forage plant species that we can help to come back and help to increase the distribution and diversities that are available that existed at some time in the past within the burned area but may not exist now. And so we have to look at historical records and range documents to find what may or may not have been here and how it was distributed. And then work with organizations such as the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Arizona Elk Society, Mule Deer Foundation, the Arizona Deer Association, National Wild Turkey Federation, to garner funding to buy browse species seeds, and volunteers that we have a list of volunteers that the Sportsmen for Wildlife organization has been keeping these past weeks, and put those volunteers to work in the field and start planting seeds. Hand planting is the least invasive, easiest NEPA-wise to work with, to get the ability to be in the field actually manipulating the habitat, which does require that NEPA process be followed. But we'll be able to put browse species back into places where we haven't seen it because of the fire regime that's been in this country for a number of years. Down along the East Fork of the Black River, just downstream from Diamond Rock, this is one of the areas that it's an important recreational area to the forest. This is a highly used campground, stretch of the stream that gets fished a lot, but it was also heavily impacted during the Wallow Fire. It'll probably be some time before they're able to stabilize the slopes and the roads and the drainages to make it safe for forest users again. I know it's important for the forest to address, but with the limited resources and the vast acres that have been impacted by the Wallow Fire, it may not happen immediately. But know that it's important to the forest for them to get in here and try to get it open. Relative to the wildlife, when we've come through here today, we've seen bear tracks along the mud of the creek. They're in here. The deer are using it. We've seen bighorn sheep in here. So the wildlife values are persisting. The burns on the slopes will take some time to recover. They'll probably have to do some cutting along these slopes to stabilize them, but the bottoms should recover pretty quick. Well, you know, we've had an opportunity today to look at many areas within the Wallow Fire. I just want to remind people that their Arizona Game and Fish Department does work for them, and we're working with the National Forest, the Apache Sitgraves, to try to gain access wherever possible, where hazards can be mitigated, and we can obtain safe and safe access for hunters and fishermen to enjoy their forest. The fire is going to have affected this access for a number of years, and we'll work wherever we can to try to open up new areas as we go along. This fall, most of the forest will be open. Probably 30% of it or less will be closed relative to the high intensity burn areas. And remember, as you go out and enjoy your national forest while you're hunting and fishing, that it's your responsibility to look up, look down, and look around. Situational awareness is what they train our firefighters, and it's good for us to keep that in mind too, because if you're aware of your surroundings, less opportunity for you to put yourself in a bad situation. The Arizona Game and Fish Department encourages you to use that time you have available to be outside with your family, hunting and fishing and enjoying Arizona. Thank you.
Thanks for watching today's show. I hope we were able to answer some of your questions and concerns about the recovery effort and what's in store for the future of our forest and wildlife. Our forest as we know it is changed forever, and it will never be the same in our lifetime. But it's certainly not gone, not by a long shot. It will take years of rehabilitation to help the forest heal, and we're going to need to work together to help restore it. That means all of us working together to make it happen. What's done is done and can't be undone. The future of our forest is up to us. Become involved with the recovery effort. You can contact the Arizona Game and Fish Department Pine Top region if you have any other questions. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in next week for another edition of Steppin' Outdoors.